The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kamala Bandepalli, and I am a GRC consultant at IT Governance. Excuse me today, I've got a bit of just recovering from a cold and a cough, but we should be fine. In this webinar, I will be providing you with practical introduction in terms of how you should be going about preparing your documentation to meet the requirements of the PCI DSS standards. This webinar is a part of a series of webinars that IT Governance has produced to offer recommendations and insights to help you achieve and maintain PCI DSS compliance. You can download the previous webinars from our website. The details will also be provided at the end of the webinar. Also, please note, everyone will be muted for the duration of the webinar. There will be an opportunity at the end to address some of your questions. So please enter them in the question function of the GoToWebinar control panel as we go along, or you can save them till the end, however is convenient for you. So for anyone wondering, we will also be emailing everyone a copy of the presentation slides and the webinar recording. Okay, so first of all, let me just tell you a little about IT Governance. We've been helping clients secure their information and comply with the industry standards since 2005. In fact, two of our directors are responsible or were responsible for the world's first successful implementation of information security management system. That at that point sort of conformed to BS 7799. BS 7799 is the forerunner for ISO 27001 that is being very widely used in the industry today. Excuse me. Our consultancy practice now helps clients in protecting and securing their intellectual capital, complying with the relevant standards, not just PCI regulation, not PCI DSS, but other regulations and standards such as ISO, risk and other cybersecurity regulations and standards as well. We also help our clients in thriving as they achieve the strategic goals to betterment through the betterment of their IT management. We are also leading provider of PCI training courses from foundation level to advanced level, as well as the e-learning courses as well. So you can sign up to any of these. All the details are on our website. As an authorized QSA company, that is IT Governance is a QSA company. QSA, as you must be knowing, is a qualified security assessor who assesses merchants or service providers for compliance of PCI DSS. So IT Governance has been certified by the PCI Security Standards Council as a QSA to auditor merchants for PCI DSS compliance, which means that our consultants follow a recognized approach to securing cardholder data under PCI DSS, keeping their skills relevant and current as well. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the steps involved in preparing your documentation to meet the PCI DSS standards. During this webinar, I'll explain the differences between a policy, a form, and a procedure, how to identify which policies and clauses you need to address, and how to clearly state the tasks and the responsibilities your company has when handling payment card data. So that's what we'd be looking at today. So what we would be also, at the end of the slide, you should be able to, understand the management, understand better the management of your data protection responsibilities, how your organization's protection is, from weakest insecurity and from the people. And also we'll look at policies that are the foundations providing directions, instructions, and responsibilities assignments. Okay, so introduction to policies and procedures. What exactly are they? From policy to procedure to configuration standards, a significant proportion of payment card industry data security standard compliance begins with documentation. So drafting a fully detailed policies and documentation for data protection is vital. It's very important to improve security of your customers, your stakeholders, and your brand, because it reveals your understanding and commitment to PCI DSS. So PCI DSS compliance, what it requires is merchants and service providers to document the processes and the procedures that they have put in place that support the security of the cardholder data that they hold in their organization. Your policies and procedures can then serve as a guide from which you and your qualified security assessor, the QSA, who come to assess your compliance, can work during your assignment. So on the basis of these documents, your QSA will then follow defined testing procedures to verify that your documented controls have been implemented. So the QSA would first look at your documentation, then would like to look at how the procedures are. He'll test the procedures, he'll ask you questions, and then sort of assess the compliance of PCI DSS and how strongly it is implemented or how well it has been implemented. So maintaining documentation also helps in protect your organization from negative impacts of the data breach as well. So documented security policies and procedures can help your QSA or forensic investigators, that is in case that you've already had a breach, to see what security measures your organization has in place or identify where in a process something went wrong. So it's really important that you very accurately document the processes and the procedures that you have in your organization. And this documentation is maintained throughout and not just as a one-off exercise. So, what is in a PCI policy? A PCI policy is a high-level document. It should set out the key parameters around how an organization manages its cardholder data environment. Remember, cardholder data environment is not just the systems that you have, but it's also the processes, the technology, the people as well. So most organizations will establish a set of policies relating to its key procedures and business interests. And some of these may be subordinate to the PCI policy. So such policies that you already have in place, which come under PCI policy, are things like information security. So information security policy that you have in your organization, it sets out the organization security strategy in relation to the storage, processing, and transmission of payment card data. It defines information security responsibilities for all staff, contractors, partners, and your third parties that access the cardholder data environment. So irrespective of who's accessing the cardholder data environment, the information security policy should address the security of the cardholder data environment, including all of these entities. Okay. The other kind of policies that PCI may address is things like security awareness policies or procedures that you may have in place. So these awareness documentation identifies the organization's responsibilities when implementing a PCI security awareness training program. So this could be for anyone who accesses the cardholder data environment. So what this should do is set out the objectives of the awareness training program that you have in place, such as ensuring ongoing awareness and refresher training, i.e. it should make clear in terms of what training entails, how often it is conducted, and who is it conducted to, who is it relevant to, details such as that. Another example that we might take, another such policy that you might, PCI policy might address, is the incident response policy. So incident response policy in an organization outlines your approach to detecting, responding, and limiting the effects of the information security event. And what it will need is the organization to develop one or more response plans. So as an organization, you will have some response plans in place. You will need to identify your risks, your incidents, what incidents that you can, from the risks, what incidents that you that can occur, and we have response plans in place. So without a plan in place, the organization might not detect an attack, fail to follow proper protocol to contain and recover from it. So as we've seen, so you've got the as I mentioned, the information security policies, security awareness, incident response policies are the policies that may come, which the organization may already have them, but it should could be a subordinate policy for PCI DSS requirements as well. So each of these policies, again, would be supported further by one or more procedures or work instructions. Now, they are instructions that set up practical implementation of that particular policy. So, for instance, awareness of the training procedures will explain how often training should occur, as I mentioned, the process for reviewing the training material, how the resources are allocated, so on and so forth. That's what it would look at. So nothing that is listed here should surprise an experienced security professional, because they could, all these, if you are really good in your organization with security as a security professional, you would know that these policies already exist within your organization. They are the basis of your security governance. The policy requirements are basic for information security best practices. Therefore, when structuring your PCI policy, it is advisable to do so along with wider information security activities. Okay, so what is the issue then? So the issue is, if you're already, the issue is the PCI DSS places a significant emphasis on documentation. So that's the only way that a QSA can actually get an overview of what you have in place. So all 12 sections of PCI DSS include requirements for documented policies and procedures. So the scale of the challenge, especially for bigger organizations that have complicated procedures, the scale of the challenge depends upon how the organization accepts card payments. The greater the number of payment channels, the greater the need would be for documented policies and procedures to support the applicable requirements. But again, unsurprisingly, organizations often struggle to work out what they need to develop to best reflect their environment. There is a lot of requirements, there are a lot of documentations required, and therefore organizations do struggle to work out what they should and shouldn't have, or what's best for their cardholder data environment. Okay, so if you look at this, it shows, this slide sort of shows how much documentation is needed per clause regarding the specific self-assessment questionnaire types and its description. So you can see on the left-hand side the self-assessment questionnaire types. So A, AEP, B, BIP, C, CVT, P2P, D, and D for service providers. And then you have the description of what these FAQs are. But then on the right-hand side, you'll see per clause how many number of documentation is required. So the minimum that you see for SAQ-A is 20, and the maximum that you see for SAQ-D for service providers is 234. So it isn't surprising that many of the companies find it really difficult or very, or as I mentioned in the previous slide, they do struggle to work out what is the best way of going about developing this documentation, because it is a lot of a big amount of work, and therefore will require a lot of resource, especially for smaller companies where they do not have a lot of resource. It could be a struggle putting all of this in place. So now that you've looked at it and you've looked at the number of documentation required, even when where a documentation has developed a professional set of documentation, it can still fail to achieve its intended results. For a policy to be truly effective, the policy needs to be enforced. A policy will only be effective if it is clearly understood and it's adhered to rigorously. So it's good to have a policy. Many organizations do have it, but how effective is it? How effectively is it being implemented? And how easy is it to understand and follow? That's the challenge. So, so let's look at what is it, or what does developing a policy involve? So significant benefit of creating a policy document comes from the process of agreeing what is it that you're protecting, what protection of card data means to your organization, and developing a structured responses to those needs that you have. The outputs that you come with, it should be practical and they should be useful for the business. Policy should ideally contain a policy scope. So, you know, if a problem is well stated, a problem is half solved. So that's a saying by Charles Kettering, the inventor. So the policy scope should give you a succinct explanation of a problem or issue that the policy addresses. The problem statement should be designed to address the 5 W's that are on the screen there: who, what, where, when, and why. So if you look at the 5 W's from the previous slide, what are they? So the 5 W's: who, where, what, when, and why. So who is the board and the management must be completely behind and be committed to PCI DSS compliance program. Policy must therefore be issued under their authority. So it's really important that any compliance program that you have in place, especially PCI DSS, it is fully backed by the board and the management. Without the board and the management's commitment, it is very easy to lose sight, to go wrong, and also maybe lose the motivation through in the middle of the project. So it's important that you have their support. Where is in terms of parts of the organization to which the PCI policy is going to apply. That needs to be clearly identified as well. It's important that you clearly identify what parts of organization, i.e. Where your CDE cardholder data environment applies. The next is what. So what defines what is it that you want to protect, and what do you expect of your system users? That's what that talks about. So it's important that you define that as well clearly. When sort of sets the active date of the policy and all the procedures that are derived from it. So the whole information security program has a defined active period. So the policies and the documentation that you have in place, it needs to be reviewed regularly. It should be subjected to reviews at least annually, and this review period should be defined in the policy, and also for the procedures as well. It's important they are regularly reviewed and are kept up to date. So that should be mentioned in the policy as well. and why. So why sort of should describe why the policy is necessary and outlines the consequences of not having the solution in place. So what happens if you do not adhere to this policy? What happens if you don't have a policy in place? So that needs to be clearly defined to the end user who's reading it, and they need to identify so that they can understand what would happen if they do not follow the policy. Let us then look at the procedures for PCI DSS compliance. Procedures provide step-to-step instructions for the staff to perform routine security tasks consistently, which ensure that preventative, detective, and/or response mechanisms work as planned. The level of detail depends upon the specific operation. Some procedures will necessarily be more detailed than the others. But procedures for PCI DSS compliance might include things like incident response procedures that describe how to respond to alerts that could indicate an incident, checklists for configuring a device that proves that the standards involved are followed, daily operations checklists to confirm that all procedures were performed, and also things like monitoring procedures as well. What is monitored, where it is monitored, how it is monitored, how often it is done, whose responsibility. So all the procedures that you actually define within your organization or within your departments or your teams could be a part of PCI DSS compliance documentation. The critical characteristics of the procedure is that they must provide clear instructions and also be, very broadly speaking, internally complete so that anyone can follow them, whether it is someone who's newly joining a department or even an experienced professional within the organization who would want to look at the instructions and procedures. They should easily be able to understand what the process or the procedure is that they need to follow to do a particular a job. Yeah, there are many vendors that offer prepackaged policies and procedures, templates, but none can provide a complete prepackaged procedures. Procedures are written by and for your organization and are necessarily specific to it. So you can buy these prepackaged templates, but it's important that they are aligned to your organization. The implementation of the procedures that you follow in your organization, it is important they're reflected accurately and properly within these procedures. That's the important bit. Again, as I mentioned, there are many templates that are available in the market you can buy. Okay, so let's look at the standards, guidelines, and forms. So what exactly are these? So standard is a detailed document that describes how something should be configured, such as you've got firewall rule sets, operating hardening system guidelines. You've got firewall standards. Now they might be developed in-house, or you have, or you can adopt it from any third party to take advantage of wider expertise. So you can have standards within your organization where the senior consultants can put some standards that everyone can follow, or otherwise you have standards such as the ISO standards that you can use, third-party standards you can use to actually implement within your organization. Standards again, for example, they define, for example, how to code securely in various programming environments, how IP address ranges are defined, the network architecture and firewalls, and even the architecture, any network architecture, any security devices that you may have in your organization, and how these defined devices are configured. So there are standards like these that you can implement, or you can use the, as I said, third-party standards as well. Now, what exactly are guidelines? So guidelines provide advice on the most effective or easiest way to comply with the specific standards. So you have standards that you've adopted. You need guidelines in terms of how best to follow those standards. So especially when you have multiple options, where such as do's and don'ts of when setting a password and things like that. When you have multiple standards, you can opt guidelines to follow them to make it clearer and easier for you to implement it. And what are forms? So forms are used to track when tasks have been performed and or the results of performing an action. So forms are vital for recording when and any operational tasks have been completed and need to contain the level of detail expected by PCI DSS. So for example, if someone requires an access to CDE, you can have a form in place to identify, to capture details in terms of why they need access to CDE, what kind of access do they need, and any relevant details, and then make an assessment in terms of if they should be given access or if they don't. So forms can be used for decision making, capture data or information, and also decision making as well. Okay, so PCI DSS requires documentation of all kinds. So it's not just the policies and procedures to be reviewed as part of the audit process, but it is also important that making the documentation available to both your employees and external auditors as well. It is vital, actually, to maintain security and demonstrating of compliance. So the documentation helps you maintain security, track it, monitor it, and also demonstrate compliance as well. Building a document library need not be at a significant expense. It can be simple as creating a shared folder on your internet. The chief requirement is to ensure that you have a central repository for all approved documents. So all the documents are at one place and people are not struggling to find any documentation that is required as part of their day-to-day job or even that they need for reference. So whenever or whatever method you use to deploy your documentation, you will need to ensure that the appropriate access control mechanisms are in place. You should also consider the need of version control and implement tools that can help automate the mapping of each of the document to the PCI DSS. So you can have automation within your organization as well. IT governance provides document analysis tool, and it is an optimal way to achieve full control of the documentation in compliance with the PCI DSS requirements. But it can also be used as an organization tool, helping you to store and provide access to an organized fashion to all the approved documentation. We will look at the tool in the next few slides. Okay, so this is an example that shows when starting the self-assessment questionnaire in the executive summary, the tool needs indication as to which type applies to the company. So here, if you see in that yellow background in that box, the kind of SAQ type that we are using for this example is a C. That is a drop-down box. So depending upon your organization, you can select the kind of SAQ type that you will be completing. Okay, so this way it's possible to track the progress of the document completion listed in the document listing. In this case also, the SAQ type chosen is C, as you can see, and it applies to merchants with a payment application connected to the internet and no electronic storage of cardholder data. So SAQ, that's what SAQC is for. So you complete an SAQ. The SAQ is a self-assessment questionnaire that you complete. You complete the self-assessment questionnaire type C if in your organization you have a payment application connected to the internet and there is no electronic storage of the cardholder data. This normally applies to small merchants who deployed an off-the-shelf bought software to a standalone machine for taking individual payments. So you can see there, for example purposes, we've selected SAQ type C. Okay, so as you can see in the document listing, while performing the SAQ, you need to follow the related column of the chosen SAQ type. So here you can see SAQ C is in column M, and according to the requirements highlighted there, just look at line 60 that is highlighted in yellow. Confirm if each documentation has been completed by changing no to yes with a drop-down menu in each cell of this column. So if you look at column J, you've got column H, sorry. It has been selected there that line 60 or row 60 is a documentation PCI DSS clause encryption for transmission over open networks. So you run through all the clauses mentioned in there, and against it in column H, sort of select in terms of what documentation you have in place already and what you don't. You can consult the policies and procedures documentation to double check the document completion and the compliance with the required clause. So yeah, once you have all of this completed, you can look at the policies and procedures documentation that we have, and then wherever there are gaps, you could look to complete it that way. So this is the policies procedures. Within the policies and procedures library, you've got the templates of various policies that IT governance is provided. So when consulting the policies and procedures library, ensure that the document control reference is the correct one. So you see the text highlighted in yellow on your screen. So at the top right hand side, you've got the document control, which sort of gives you the reference number, the issue number, the issue date, and the page number. So that's the document control. Ensure that that is up to date. You may align this to your organization, but you need to ensure that that is properly aligned and it is properly referenced as well. By reviewing the steps, you can double check the completion of your documentation and its compliance according to PCI DSS. Again, here in 3.12, now this is a PCI DSS cardholder data policy statement. So on the point 3.12, it talks about transmission of cardholder data. You can review each of these points against what you've got in your organization and update it accordingly. So transmission of cardholder data must be encrypted over public or open networks, including the internet, GPRS, 3G, etc., using select the relevant standards as set out in requirement 4.1 of PCI DSS. The cryptography policy is so and so and so. So you review these, you can double check the completion of the documentation and its compliance as per the requirements, as you can see in the example here. Okay, so this image sort of depicts in the yellow boxes through the percentage. These are the yellow boxes in the table on the left hand side. The percentage in each milestone and for visual comparison in the graph. So as and how, so if you look at the previous slides that we've looked at, especially this one, as and when that you complete a no and a yes, this sort of provides a percentage of document completion. So for the first milestone requirement, PCI DSS requirement, in this example, you have 66.67% of the documentation is completed. So you would see there, the lowest is for milestone 4, that is monitor and control access to your systems. Also on the right hand side, it sort of gives you a graphical representation of the completion of all the documentation. So these are all the documents that needs to consider. You have the document name on the left-hand side and the requirement that it is matched. It is matched up with the requirement of PCI DSS. So, for example, you have the cryptographic key management, and this is in PCI DSS 3.2.1 requirement, 3.5, and 3.3. So, if you ensure all these documents are in place, which most of you I'm sure will have, you will have covered most of these clauses, or rather, compliance with most of these clauses, as you can see here in the image, in the slide, basically. Okay, so in conclusion, so deploying security technologies can only go so far in protecting an organization and maintaining compliance. Policies are necessary to address the weak link in security, which is people. Cannot stress enough in terms of how important or how big a weakest link is people in security. Most of you coming from a security background would realize this. It is important that people know what they need to do, how they need to do, and what would happen if they don't follow. And for that reason, documentation is a big piece of work, a big requirement, very vital in attaining compliance. So it's not just having, as we've seen in the previous slides, it's not just having the documentation in place, but it is also to ensure that this documentation is available for everyone as well. So you can see here in the previous slides we've looked at is if people don't know or understand what is expected of them, they can put your cardholder data at risk. Regardless of other security measures you have in place, documentation, especially policies, play a very important role in securing data. They are the foundation for everything else, as they provide the direction and instruction and assign responsibilities as well. So the standards policy requirements are necessary information security best practices, but the complexity of this task, as you've seen, so if you've looked at the previous examples that we've been through, the amount of documentation that you will need to put in place for each and every clause. So if you, in this example, if you look at if you look at the column D, you'll see for each PCI requirement or clause, you have quite a few documentations that need to put in place. It's not just one documentation per clause. It could be multiple documentations per clause. So it may be a very tedious task. Many companies struggle with it, as we've talked about previously, and it could be a complex task as well. But then again, it depends upon your companies, it depends upon the service providers that you have. It depends upon how your security compliance or your compliance governance environment is looking like. Failure to implement and administer documentation will create severe risks for organization and result excuse me, in non-compliance as well. So within your organization as well, I mean, it's important that you define who's responsible for what as well. I mean, in terms of requirements, that should be clearly defined anyway, but it's also important that you define who's responsible for what. So it's the policy or the documentation that should state the organization has defined key roles and duties, and might note some of these, especially the important ones. The ones where any of the directors or program heads, etc., are accountable for any of the processes and procedures, and that they are responsibilities for complying with the policy level, with the policy at every level. So all this kind of information and oversight for an employee would come from documentation. And it's not just to the employees, but also to the assessor who comes to assess your PCI DSS compliance. He would get this information from documentation as well. So it's important that you document all this information for, in order to be compliant with PCI DSS. But also remember that the documentation of PCI DSS is not a one-off exercise. It is ongoing. It needs to be maintained very regularly. You cannot do this as an exercise just before an assessment. It needs to be done regularly, and therefore you can now look at the kind of task that could be to actually put these documents together, and if you already have them in place, to ensure that they are accurate and proper and up to date as well. Okay, so before we go, I'd like to share some details of our past webinars and raise your awareness about the next one in this series. Our next webinar is to take place on the 5th of December between 3 to 4 p.m., where we will be looking at, or we will take a look at how vulnerability scanning and penetration testing can be used to help prevent data breaches, and also to understand security weaknesses and test your security controls. You can also gain access to all of our previous webinars and resources on PCI DSS by going on our website, basically, which is https www.itgovernance.co.uk/PCI-DSS-resource-center. So the previous ones, as you can see on your screen, that we have completed is PCI DSS Challenge or Opportunity, PCI DSS Audit Success in 9 essential steps, and PCI DSS Self-Assessment Questionnaire. And then we have another one coming up, which is on PCI DSS Security Testing. So yeah, all these webinars are very resourceful, very helpful, give you a really good understanding of your PCI DSS requirements or questions to ensure you can make use of it. Also, as I mentioned right in the beginning of the webinar, you can watch these online, and if you are registered to us, you will receive an email as well of the slideshows and webinar recordings. So we've got about 15 minutes. If there are any questions that you'd like to ask, I'm here to answer to the best of my knowledge. Thank you. So a couple of questions that was previously that I'm looking at that was previously asked was in terms of the complete documentation that is required for PCI DSS. As we have seen, for each clause within PCI DSS, there is various requirements, but then again, it depends upon the kind of organization, the services that you have, the complexity of your organization that you have in place, that you're, or the complexity of your processes, the number of processes that you have in terms of how much documentation that you will require. We have seen in the previous slides in terms of the required number of documentation per clause. But then, as I've also mentioned, that most of the organizations have most of these documentation in place. PCI DSS covers, as part of PCI DSS, if you already have these documentation in place, you may then, the work that you will need to do then, if you already have not considered, is to ensure PCI DSS requirements are covered off as part of the policies and procedures. Hope that answers your questions. I have a question here. Thank you. Really well delivered. Just a quick question regarding merchant awareness on the policy and procedures to reinforce the proof of compliance rather than just relying on FAQs. And taking people's word for it regarding compliance. Do you have examples of bad practices where they are just using the standards as a tick box? There are many organizations that use standards as just as a tick box. It's good practice to use standards. It's good practice in your if you are following this particular set of standards for various jobs within your or various departments or processes within your organization. But it's important that you not just follow the standards, but you implement it and it is reviewed in terms of the documentation of the processes are reviewed to ensure compliance with the standards that you're following. Many of the organizations have standards in place. I've been to audits where ISO audits especially, where standards have been followed. However, it's just followed. They do not have any documentation in place to back up or to evidence that they are following standards. So in that way, that they do say that they are following something. However, when it actually comes to showing compliance without actually any documentation in place, you wouldn't be able to show compliance. So it's good to follow standards, but ensure that it is being implemented and it is being maintained. Another question that I have here, as a rule, how often should policy and procedure documents be updated? So as a rule, we would say at least annually or whenever you have a significant change within the organization. But yeah, as a rule, at least annually. At least policies should be reviewed at least annually. Procedures whenever they are significant change, but ensure they are reviewed regularly as well. Again, another question here. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure on this one. We can get back to you if needs be. However, there is a lot that is in the question is there is a lot in place for merchants. What documentation do you have from an issuer's perspective? From my knowledge, well, whether a merchant or an issuer, they have to be. It is best practice. It is mandated to ensure that they are PCI DSS compliant. However, issuers do deal with payment brands. Payment brands can advise issuers in terms of what kind of security practices, best practices that they should be following. But as a thumb rule, as a basic nowadays, any of the payment brands do expect you to be compliant, at least on a contractual basis, with PCI DSS. PCI DSS again was formed by all these 5 big payment brands coming together. So whether you're an issuer or a merchant, it is not a law. PCI DSS is still not a law, but nowadays it's very popular that many companies actually do expect contractually, especially if you're holding cardholder data or processing it, then for you to be, they'd expect you to be PCI DSS compliant, whether you're an issuer or a merchant. If you have any further questions, we can post them through, then we can answer it for you. Got another 10 minutes if you'd like, or if you have any questions. I have another question here from an issuer's perspective. Is there a particular SAQ that would be most applicable? In terms of what SAQ is applicable to you, depends upon the amount of transactions, card payment transactions that you do deal with. Yeah, sorry, the amount of cardholder transactions or card payments that you deal with. I think that sort of gives you a clear picture in terms of what kind of an SAQ that you should be filling. There is not one SAQ applies to all sort of yeah, it depends upon the setup that you have in place and the number of card transactions that you have that you deal with as well. So yeah, it depends upon what kind of payment channels that you have in your company or in your organization. And if you are having any doubts in terms of what SAQ you have a lot of resources online on the PCI Council website, or you can directly speak to your payment brands that you deal with, and they should be able to advise you on, or they'll tell you in terms of in terms of what's relevant to you and what isn't. They might give you some kind of a direction, some kind of an advice in terms of how to go about it. I've got 2 more minutes and we can then log off. If you have any further questions, I can answer it for you. Time today. If you have any further questions, yeah, please get it over to IT governance. But thank you very much for your questions that you've asked so far. Take care. Goodbye.